The day they called me into the conference room, I already knew something was wrong. Not because of my work, not because of performance, but because no one would look me in the eyes. Their smiles were tight, rehearsed, the kind people use when they are about to do something they know is wrong. I was 7 months pregnant. Tired, yes. Slower than before, maybe. But still delivering results that department depended on. I had stayed late. Missed doctor appointments. Proved, again and again, that pregnancy had not weakened my commitment. Still, as I sat down, I felt the verdict before it was spoken. They talked about restructuring. About budgets. About future alignment. Words stacked carefully to hide the truth. Then it landed. My position was being eliminated effective immediately. They said it had nothing to do with my pregnancy, yet their eyes kept drifting to my stomach like it was the real problem. I walked out carrying a cardboard box instead of maternity plans. My badge deactivated before I reached the elevator. Coworkers avoided me, afraid association might cost them next. By the time I reached the parking lot, my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from humiliation. That night, I cried quietly so my unborn child would not feel my stress. I promised her something through those tears. I promised that this moment would not define us. That being discarded would not be our story's ending. What they did not know is that I had been building something quietly for years. Skills they overlooked. Networks they underestimated. Knowledge they never bothered to ask about. Losing that job did not break me. It redirected me. As I packed away my old work laptop, I realized something that changed everything. They had just freed me from playing small in their world, and one day, they would learn exactly what that mistake cost them. The weeks that followed were heavier than I expected, not because of money, but because of silence. No calls from HR. No follow-ups. No apology disguised as concern. It was as if I had been erased the moment I became inconvenient. I spent long afternoons sitting by the window, one hand on my stomach, reminding myself that quitting was not an option anymore. Medical bills arrived quickly. Savings drained faster than planned. I sold my car and moved into a smaller apartment without telling anyone why. Pride had already been taken from me at that office. I refused to let desperation take the rest. Late at night, while the city slept, I worked. I turned skills I had sharpened for someone else's profit into something of my own. Consulting projects at first. Quiet contracts under neutral company names. I did not announce anything. I did not need applause. I needed momentum. Motherhood arrived the same way my firing had. Abrupt. Life-changing. Exhausting. And yet, powerful. Holding my daughter for the first time rewired something inside me. Every doubt became fuel. Every rejection became strategy. I learned to work in fragments of time, building between feedings and sleepless nights. The irony was brutal. The company that fired me for being pregnant relied heavily on systems I had helped design. I still saw their weaknesses clearly. I knew where they were strong and where they were vulnerable. That knowledge became my edge. Within a year, my small operation stabilized. Within 2, it grew. Clients stayed. Referrals came. Revenue followed. I kept my footprint invisible, reinvesting everything. No luxury. No celebration. Just quiet expansion. Occasionally, I checked the news. The company was still standing, but not thriving. Leadership changes. Missed projections. Lawsuits whispered about but never confirmed. I watched without emotion. They thought removing me solved a problem. They never realized they had created one. Because while they were busy maintaining appearances, I was building something patient, something scalable, something powerful. And my daughter grew up watching a woman who refused to disappear. That would matter more than any revenge ever could. By the 3rd year, exhaustion no longer scared me. I had learned how to function through it, how to think clearly while the rest of the world slept. My daughter grew alongside the business, her milestones quietly marking mine. First steps. First words. First profitable quarter that proved I was no longer surviving, but scaling. What began as consulting transformed into a firm with real influence. I hired slowly and deliberately, choosing people who had been overlooked, pushed aside, or underestimated like I once was. Loyalty came naturally when respect was real. We built systems that solved problems faster than competitors twice our size. Clients noticed. Investors followed. I never used my name publicly. The company operated behind a holding group that kept everything discreet. Power, I learned, did not need visibility to be effective. It needed leverage. One afternoon, a former colleague reached out. Casual at first, then curious. He asked if I was still freelancing, mentioning that my old company was struggling to adapt. He said leadership was panicking, scrambling to keep up with changes they did not understand. I thanked him and said nothing more. That night, I pulled their financials. Public records told a clear story. Debt climbing. Market share shrinking. Internal instability masked by confident press releases. The company that once dismissed me as disposable was now vulnerable to. I did not rush. Timing mattered. Over the next year, my firm expanded into adjacent markets. We acquired smaller companies quietly, absorbing talent and technology. Our valuation rose steadily. I watched my former employer lose ground, contract by contract, mistake by mistake. Sometimes, late at night, I remembered the conference room. The rehearsed smiles. The careful words meant to disguise discrimination. The way they avoided my eyes as if shame were contagious. That memory no longer hurt. It sharpened me. When the opportunity finally appeared, it did not feel dramatic. It felt inevitable. A chance to buy controlling interest through a sequence of overnight acquisitions. Legal. Clean. Silent. I closed my laptop and looked at my daughter sleeping peacefully in the next room. They thought pregnancy made me weak. They were about to learn what patience could build. The opportunity did not announce itself loudly. It arrived disguised as routine news buried deep in a financial report most people would skip. A pending debt restructuring. A quiet search for emergency capital. A deadline that could not be missed. I read it twice, then a third time, feeling my pulse slow instead of race. This was it. Still I waited. Suspense is strongest when nothing seems to happen. Behind the scenes, my team moved carefully. Lawyers reviewed every angle. Analysts ran scenarios late into the night. We mapped timelines down to the hour. If we moved too early, they would recover. Too late, and someone else would step in. The window was narrow, unforgiving. Meanwhile, life tested my patience. My daughter fell sick the same week negotiations began. Sleepless nights returned, sharper than before. I worked from a hospital chair, laptop balanced on my knees, whispering calls while machines beeped softly nearby. In those moments, I almost laughed at the contrast. Years ago, they said pregnancy made me unreliable. Now motherhood was the reason I refused to fail. News from my former company grew darker. Executives resigned suddenly. Stock dipped. Rumors of internal chaos leaked despite their attempts to control the narrative. Employees I once mentored were leaving in waves. The foundation was cracking. I authorized the first move. A silent acquisition through one of our subsidiaries. No headlines. No celebration. Just paperwork signed after midnight. By morning, a crucial portion of their debt belonged to us. They still did not notice. The second move followed quickly. Another stake purchased. Another lever gained. Each step tightened the net, though from the outside, nothing looked different. Their offices still lit up at night. Their leadership still smiled for press photos. But control was slipping through their fingers. I watched it all with unsettling calm. Because the most powerful moment in revenge is not confrontation. It is the moment before they realize they have already lost. And that moment was getting closer by the hour. The pressure inside their company finally began to surface publicly. Emergency meetings were called. Consultants were brought in at outrageous fees. Leadership issued optimistic statements that fooled no one who understood the numbers. From where I stood, the desperation was almost visible, like cracks spreading beneath fresh paint. I stayed silent and moved faster. Our legal team finalized structures that layered ownership so cleanly it looked accidental from the outside. Each acquisition connected to the next like pieces of a puzzle no one inside their company realized they were part of. Control was no longer a question of if. It was a matter of when. A former manager from my old department reached out through a mutual contact. He asked if I knew investors willing to help stabilize their situation. The irony nearly made me smile. Years ago, he had signed off on my termination without hesitation. Now his voice carried urgency instead of authority. I told him I would see what I could do. Behind closed doors, I approved the final funding round that would give us majority voting rights. The transaction was scheduled overnight, timed deliberately when their board would be scattered and distracted. By the time they woke up, the balance of power would already be rewritten. At home, I tucked my daughter into bed and sat beside her longer than usual. I thought about the version of me who walked out of that office pregnant and humiliated. I wished she could see this moment, not for validation, but for peace. Just before midnight, confirmations began to arrive. One signature, then another. Screens refreshed. Percentages shifted. Control locked in. I closed my laptop and took a deep breath. They were sleeping, unaware that the company they once used to discard me had just changed hands. No confrontation. No warning. No drama. By morning, I would no longer be a former employee. I would be their new owner, and they would have to face me, not as a problem they eliminated, but as the decision they could never undo. Morning arrived quietly, unaware of the shift it carried. I watched the city wake up from my office window while confirmation emails stacked in my inbox. Final approvals. Legal clearance. Board notifications queued for release. Everything was complete. The company that once erased me from its system now belonged to me on paper and in power. Still, I did not rush in. Revenge is not loud. It is precise. The first sign reached them through confusion. Executives noticed changes in access permissions. Voting structures adjusted overnight. Emergency calls were made to legal teams who had no comforting answers. Control had moved, and no one could explain how so quickly. The second came when a mandatory board meeting was scheduled with no clear agenda. Panic spread internally. Senior leaders demanded explanations. Investors asked questions no one could answer. The company email system buzzed with speculation. I arrived at headquarters late that morning, not as an employee, but as ownership. Security hesitated for a brief moment before checking the updated authorization list. My name cleared instantly. The doors opened without resistance. Inside, familiar faces froze. Some recognized me immediately. Others needed a moment, scanning my face, searching memory, feeling something collapse inside them when realization struck. The woman they dismissed during pregnancy was standing there calm, composed, and completely untouchable. I did not smile. I did not rush. I walked into the executive floor like I had always belonged there. Because I had, the boardroom filled quickly. Fear replaced arrogance. People who once avoided eye contact now could not stop watching me. I took my seat without announcement. The silence stretched longer than any presentation ever could. Then the board chair spoke, outlining the change in ownership and authority. My role. My control. My final decision-making power. No one interrupted. That was the moment it landed. They had not just lost control of a company. They had handed it to the woman they believed pregnancy made disposable, and the meeting had only just begun. The air inside the boardroom felt heavier with every second that passed. No one spoke unless asked. The same leaders who once filled rooms with confidence now sat stiff, hands folded, waiting to be told what came next. Power had reversed so completely that even breathing sounded loud. I began by reviewing the company's recent decisions. Not emotionally. Not personally. Just facts. Missed opportunities. Poor leadership calls. A culture built on fear instead of performance. Each point landed harder because it was undeniable. They knew I understood the company better than anyone in that room. I always had. Then I addressed policies. Maternity protections that existed on paper but failed in practice. Quiet dismissals disguised as restructuring. Careers ended without accountability. Faces shifted. Some looked down. Others stared straight ahead, frozen. I explained that the company would change immediately. Leadership roles would be reevaluated. Departments audited independently. Complaints reopened. Every decision that once hid behind silence would now be exposed to daylight. One executive tried to speak, his voice thin and uncertain. I stopped him with a single raised hand. Not out of anger, but control. He understood instantly. This was no longer his room. I announced that I would remain anonymous to the public for now. No interviews. No statements. Just action. The company would stabilize, restructure, and rebuild under new values. Those who adapted would stay. Those who resisted would leave quietly, the same way others once had. As the meeting ended, I watched them file out. Some avoided my eyes. Others glanced back with something close to regret. None of it mattered. Later that day, I walked through the office floors I once avoided. Employees looked up, confused but hopeful. Whispers followed me, not cruel this time, but curious. Respect was beginning to replace fear. That evening, I went home and sat beside my daughter as she slept. I held her hand gently, realizing something profound. The hardest part was over, not because they were defeated, but because I had finally taken back everything they tried to take from me, and the final consequences were still unfolding. The changes did not explode across headlines. They moved quietly, deliberately, the way real justice always does. Within weeks, departments were rebuilt, leadership replaced, and policies rewritten with clarity and humanity. The company's public image shifted slowly, but inside, everything was different. Fear no longer guided decisions. Accountability did. Those who had participated in my dismissal faced consequences that matched their actions. Some were removed from leadership. Others were asked to resign under review findings they could not dispute. No shouting. No public shaming. Just outcomes they could not escape. The most powerful moment came when a new maternity policy was announced company-wide. Not as damage control, but as a standard. Paid leave. Job security. Protection that could not be bypassed by clever wording. Women would never again have to choose between motherhood and dignity inside those walls. That was my revenge, not humiliation. Not watching them suffer. But making sure what happened to me could never happen again. Months later, the company stabilized. Profits returned. Employees stayed. Trust grew. Investors praised the turnaround without ever knowing the full story behind it. I did not need recognition. I already had what mattered. One evening, I drove past the old building where everything had fallen apart years ago. I remembered the woman who left that office pregnant, carrying a box and a broken sense of fairness. She did not know how strong she was yet. Now I did. I went home, kissed my daughter goodnight, and closed a chapter that had been open far too long. They fired me for being pregnant, believing they had ended my career. Instead, they created a leader who rebuilt their world overnight, and that is the truth about revenge. Sometimes, the best answer is not anger. It is ownership. Now tell me something. Where are you watching this story from, and what time is it on your side right now? If this story hit you in the chest, subscribe to this channel for more daily revenge stories and family dramas.